Today we're going to be finishing up a unit on political rhetoric and controversy. We're going to have a little reading party because we're going to go through a fair number of speeches. And then we'll begin today, because it's going to take a while to absorb it, our unit on figures of speech. What Corbett calls schemes, meaning special orders of words in sentences, and tropes, meaning metaphoric or non-literal language. Tropes are figurative. Somewhat confusingly, Corbett calls both schemes and tropes figures of speech. But only tropes are figurative in the sense that they are metaphoric or not literal. Don't blame me for Corbett's terms. And frankly, I don't care whether you use them or not. What I care about is whether you can recognize these schemes and tropes, and more importantly, whether you can employ some of them in your own writing and speaking. It is sometimes thought that schemes and tropes are like the decorations on a cake. You know those little rosettes or the little squiggly things? No, they're not that. They're more important than that. Well, you say, maybe they're like the icing on the cake then. They just kind of cover it with a nice sugar coat. No, they're more important than that. Schemes and tropes are an essential ingredient. They're like the egg that you put in the actual batter to make the cake. They're the protein. There's what gives it oomph. And they are actually inseparable from the thought expressed. They're not simply a piece of tinsel hung on it. This is why, to repeat again, as I've mentioned it before in this class, Ted Sorensen, the very fine speechwriter for John Kennedy, said 3 things essential in writing a speech or presenting something to the public: brevity, be as short as you can; clarity, be as clear as you can; and poetry. And by poetry, he meant artful arrangements of words that are memorable. So during the last part of the class today, I'm going to look at a particular address on a serious subject, and we're going to examine it particularly for schemes in that address. And that is the address that Elie Wiesel, who taught at Boston University and was a survivor of the Holocaust, gave at the White House when President Reagan presented him with the nation's highest civilian honor, the Medal of Freedom. And Elie Wiesel gave this address in order to ask Reagan not to do something that he was planning to do. Now you can say it takes a little bit of chutzpah to receive a medal and then ask the person who's giving it to you not to do something, but that's what he did. And we'll look at that near the end of the hour. If you haven't read that yet, that's fine. I sent out an email and suggested if you could get to it, that would be good. But we'll get to it or fairly late in this hour, and you'll be able to see how effectively Wiesel uses schemes, how he uses language to very great effect. So if you have in our own words, could you turn again to what Shirley Chisholm says? This is beginning on page 279. We talked about this just a little bit last time, but I want to run through this and some other speeches to talk in part about themes that run through American political rhetoric as well. Because in part, this is, of course, not just on rhetoric. It's built on the subject matter of American history, social history, and political history. So Shirley Chisholm was, as your headnote tells you, the first African-American woman elected to Congress. And she was a defender of the disadvantaged. She gives this address in 1969. The United States is still embroiled in Vietnam at that time. It has fought a long and very costly war in Vietnam, costly in terms of lives lost, primarily from people who were drafted and could not get college deferments or other sorts of excuse from the draft. And it was also a very expensive war and led in the 1970s, along with the oil embargo and other factors, to extreme inflation. Now, anyone here take economics 10? What's inflation?
When the cost of living goes up.
Yeah, the cost of living goes up. It goes up rather quickly, too. So all of a sudden you turn around and staples that you buy at the grocery store, or gasoline you buy for your car, or power that you buy, or housing, they all go up faster than wages, particularly. That's when inflation is quite punishing. Runaway inflation can bring a country down. There's been runaway inflation in Venezuela recently. There was runaway inflation in Germany after World War I. And I remember a lovely man who came to the United States in the 1930s, a tailor, Mr. Fetzing, who used to mend things for my family, used to tell us true stories of going to the grocery store in Germany in the 1920s with a wheelbarrow filled with paper money, because inflation was so out of hand. It happens. And of course, to this day, the German people are very hesitant to borrow much or use credit cards a great deal. They just simply take an attitude toward inflation which is somewhat different, perhaps, than that in the United States. So Chisholm is talking about an anti-missile defense system that is being developed, which at that time, she says, cost $9 billion. Today, that would probably be something in the neighborhood of 40 or 50 billion, given what actual inflation has been since 1969. Did we develop anti-missile systems? Yes. Do they work? Yes, that's what I would say too. Some of them work. Iron Dome seems to have had some success in Israel. That's on short-range missiles. But every once in a while there are tests to see whether we can shoot down a missile that's fired across the Pacific. And occasionally we hit one of those missiles, and occasionally we miss one of those missiles. But it's very important that if you can develop a successful anti-ballistic missile system, doesn't that give you a very great advantage over your enemy? Sure. It's virtually an offensive weapon because it permits you to stop their offense. And then if they haven't developed one, they're completely vulnerable. So it's just another step in the arms race. And it was a step which was going to cost a lot of money, and indeed has cost a lot of money. It also can be destabilizing. So the United States wanted to put anti-missile defense in Europe, in Poland, say, made Russia very nervous, and so on. So Chisholm is talking about this, and she says that we're going to build a defense system against missiles. But at the same time that that was announced, the Head Start program in the District of Columbia was cut back for the lack of money. Now, what does that suggest? What does that opening paragraph suggest? We've all studied topics. What is that? And is that suggestion accurate?
It suggests that money that would go to the Head Start program in District of Columbia is being rerouted to go to the anti-missile.
Yes, that's the whole suggestion of this speech, in fact, that money spent on defense is being taken away from domestic programs. Now, is that specific case true?
Probably not.
Probably not. Appropriations are a very complicated matter. But is her general case true? That's another question. At that time, the United States was spending a large part of every tax dollar on defense. And social programs such as Head Start, which has been shown to be very effective for children. Relatively expensive, but a lot cheaper than making up for it later. So she then says, as a teacher and as a woman, I do not think I will ever understand the kind of values that can be involved in spending $9 billion and more, I am sure. Why would she say, and more, I am sure? What would be the political climate or her knowledge of the history of this kind of spending that would cause her to say, and more, I am sure? Even though it might not be true, why might she say it?
Probably because these kinds of programs are notorious for costing more than originally stated, cost overruns.
Yes, they very often have significant cost overruns. It's just a fact. Not all of them do. For example, there is a shipyard up in Maine called the Bath Iron Works, which seems to be able to build Navy ships on schedule and under budget. That's why it's known for that. But other programs, yes, very often are inflated. There were stories at about this time of things in the Defense Department costing rather large amount of money. For example, I think there was a story about a toilet seat that cost $400 and some, or a wrench that cost something like $100 and some. And these stories got out and they were embarrassing. They were actually true in some cases. So Chisholm is arguing against this. She argues against the impracticality of these systems. Then, on page 280, she says, at the top, and he said, when you cut expenditures for education, what you are doing is shortchanging the American future. Who's she quoting there? You can flip back to the previous page. She's quoting Nixon. Now, that's a very interesting move. Who's president at this time? Nixon. So this is something that I haven't seen in any of your papers. It may be in one of them, but I haven't seen it yet, which is you take a person who's putatively in your opposition, or the opposition party, you take a quotation from them, and you insert it as part of your own argument. It can be a rather effective ploy. So here she is quoting Nixon saying, when you cut expenditures for education, what you are doing is shortchanging the American future. Boom. Quoting a person against him or herself is sometimes not very polite in a personal relationship. So for example, if you've ever had a romantic partner and all of a sudden you get angry and you turn to that person and you quote something they said against them, it doesn't go down particularly well. Probably not a good strategy, even though they may actually have said that. It generally throws fuel on the fire. However, in political discourse, it's quite different. And we're going to see another example of that this morning. But frankly, I never cared too much for what people say. What I'm interested in is what they do. Apparently, launching those new programs can be delayed for a while after all. It seems we have to get some missiles launched first. Now, that's interesting use of language. What about that word launch? That's not bad. What is she doing with that word? We launch a program on a computer. That's one use of launch.
Using multiple definitions of the word?
Yeah, she's using the same word, and here there are multiple definitions, and I'm using them right next to each other. It's actually quite effective in many respects. It takes a little bit of thinking to get there. It just doesn't come automatically to you. You have to think about it. You launch a program, you launch a missile. Well, we have to launch some missiles first. She goes on to talk about the insanity of this, the missile insanity. And indeed, there was a sense in which the arms race had become insane. What was the three-letter acronym for the policy that the United States followed with nuclear weapons for a while? MAD. MAD, MAD, which stood for? Mutually assured destruction. That is to say, if you launch, all launch will both end up in total incineration. So that's a deterrent, and therefore neither one of us will dare do it. You can see, of course, how destabilizing an anti-ballistic missile system would be under that doctrine too, if you could stop all the launches of the other side of the enemy. So then she says, though, our greatest enemies are poverty, prejudice, and neglect, and that there is fantastic waste in the Defense Department. Then I want to switch to something on page 281. This is about arguing. It's also about tactics. The paragraph about the case of Pride, a vigorous, successful black organization here in Washington, conceived and built by young inner-city men. At least 6 auditors from the General Accounting Office, that's a government office, were put to work investigating Pride. They worked 7 months and spent more than $100,000. They uncovered a fraud. It was something less than $2,100. Meanwhile, millions, billions of dollars, in fact, were being spent by the Defense Department. And how many auditors, investigators were checking into their negotiated contracts? 5. So you've got 6 auditors landing on this organization, and you've got 5 auditors checking defense contracts. If that's the case, that's a fairly strong argument for a kind of lopsided application of some kind of financial oversight. Return back now to what Eisenhower said in his farewell speech, which was only 9 years before, in which he said, we have created a vast industrial military complex, and it will be permanent, and its effects will be very large. So Chisholm is to a very large degree making an argument that things have gotten out of whack. But if you are conducting public policy and you investigate something and there is a fraud, somebody did embezzle $2,100 or it is unaccounted for, what can you say to the public? What does that give you permission to say? There's been an investigation. There was a fraud. It was $2,100. What can you say now? Let's say you don't like that group, or let's say you don't like the party they're affiliated with. What do you now have the right to say? Yes, you could say that. Yes, you could say that. You could say there's fraud. There's criminal activity. There's been theft. And we have seen that kind of rhetoric time immemorial in American history, which is if there is any wrongdoing at all, the opposition party is liable to jump upon it and claim it is a scandal. This does not take into account the whole idea of proportionality. It simply doesn't. There is always discretion in the law. If someone jaywalks in Harvard Square, do you think they get stopped by the policeman standing? No. No, I don't think so. There's always discretion. But in politics, it's a little bit different. So a scandal is a scandal if you say it is so, if someone has done something wrong. But then she returns at the bottom of that page to the war that is not optional. And she raises a question which has haunted the United States ever since Vietnam. The phrase is no longer used as an optional war, but the phrase generally is instead a war of choice. What does that mean? People said the invasion of Iraq was a war of choice. What does that mean?
That we were kind of we didn't really have to go to war in that situation. We were the aggressors. At that point, we chose to go to war with Iraq. We weren't really obligated to do it.
If you use that phrase, that's essentially what you are saying. Now, one can dispute that, but that's essentially what you're saying. That it was not necessary for the absolute security of the United States to do this. Before the United States invaded Iraq, there were suggestions that Iraq had nuclear weapons and chemical weapons, and suggestions that they might use them. The phrase mushroom cloud was used. Well, it turns out not to have been true. But this whole sense of an optional conflict is one that now gets introduced into American history and remains with us. It was said more of Iraq that it was a war of choice than Afghanistan. Why? Why was it not said so much, if at all, about Afghanistan? What's the difference?
Well, with 9/11, people felt like there was a very clear mandate to go in.
Yes, it seemed that individuals responsible for the planning of 9/11 were being harbored by the then government of Afghanistan, which was asked to give them up and no longer to shelter them. And the answer of that government was, go fish. We're not going to do that. And that was, in the minds of many, permission enough to launch military action in Afghanistan, which was aimed at rooting out those individuals who were in part responsible for the attacks on 9/11. So that's why Afghanistan was not usually called something like a war of choice. Chisholm then turns to something at the end when she quotes Calvin Coolidge, who made the comment, "The business of America is business," and saying, at this time, gentlemen, the business of America is war, and it is time for a change. So here's a great and persistent theme that has colored American history ever since Eisenhower's speech and continues to this day, and I think will continue. How much money are we spending for war? Are the wars necessary? And what could that money be spent on otherwise? Or could it be kept in taxpayers' pockets? You all took a look at Senator Barry Goldwater's speech. This is on 249, and I ask you to think as you read it last time we had class whether this was an example of extreme rhetoric. And I'd like to know your thoughts on it now. This speech was given at the convention in 1964.